he was a genius physicist. But he pierced the killer mercilessly, avenging me with a cold expression. Then, he held my ashes, desperate, and slit his wrist in suicide. His pale face showed a nearly affectionate look. Melody, wait for me. When I opened my eyes, I found myself back in high school, during the time we were most at odds. I carried my backpack and stood confidently in front of him. Excuse me, I want to sit next to you. The whole class was shocked, thinking David would get impatient and beat me up. But unexpectedly, the usual gloomy, indifferent, almost murderous person remained still. His fingertips trembled for a moment before he lowered his eyes and hoarsely replied, "Okay." Since high school, David and I had been arch nemesis. Indifferent, distant, and mutual dislike. At the age of 22, I unexpectedly became an internet sensation due to a play and became a rising star actress. Brightly shining. But not long after, I heard that David was selected by the National Institute of Physics and became the youngest assistant professor there later. At the age of 25, he won the highest award for young physicists. Even more in the spotlight. This made me so angry and determined to surpass David. This kind of competition lasted for 10 years since we graduated from high school. It wasn't until I was killed by my stepsister that I realized David loved me deeply. After I died, my soul floated in the air. Watching Nancy standing in front of my grave, looking sorrowful. She cried, "Melody, you were still young, 28 years old. How did you die in a car accident?" As the mourners dispersed. Alone. Nancy's sorrowful expression turned into a resentful one, looking fierce. Nancy spoke grimly, "My dear sister, you have finally died. 12 years. A full 12 years. Do you know how I lived? You were Sam's good daughter, and I was just a stepdaughter who couldn't make it to the stage. Always being overshadowed by you. Even though you wanted to be an actress and had disputes with the family, I didn't deserve to touch a penny from the family company. You deserve to die." Her voice was sharp, her expression frantic. Looking at Nancy like this, I felt dazed. When I was 16, Nancy remarried with her mother, Wendy, to my family. She was introverted, quiet, only following behind Wendy silently, timidly showing a pair of black eyes. I found it boring, with no inclination to tease Nancy at all. Instead, I felt sorry for Nancy and reached out to her actively. "Nancy, I'm Melody." Nancy tentatively reached out her hand, giving a shy smile. "Hello, Melody." I thought that after 12 years of being together day and night, no matter what, Nancy and I could be considered close sisters. But I didn't expect her to hate me so much. On the day of the awards ceremony, Nancy deliberately tampered with my car. She caused an accident. After the car accident, a fierce fire arose. She watched me burn to death in the car. I didn't understand why my soul didn't dissipate and could only watch as Nancy acted out a scene of sisterly love with me. In my name, she ostentatiously posted videos on social media. "My dear sister has passed away, and I am also sad. But I hope you don't grieve too much because I feel that she wouldn't want you to be so sad." Once the video was released, the entire internet wept. Almost all my fans left messages on her account. What sisterly affection was that, clearly feeling so badly, yet still comforting us. Almost all my innocent and kind fans were practically led by her. Nancy used public opinion, gaining tens of thousands of followers overnight. Some even commented that she was the most touching stepsister on the internet. And my father, mourning his son in middle age, aged almost 10 years in a night, almost completely handing the company over to Nancy. Little by little, she was taking away what belonged to me. Surprisingly, David, who should have been at an awards ceremony abroad, appeared. Opening the door, the genius physicist stood pale, thin as a bamboo on the porch. David's pitch-black eyes were full of melancholy as he stared at Nancy and slowly said, "You killed Melody." Nancy recognized David. Back then, he was the mythical ice-cold top student in high school. Now, he was a renowned genius in the physics world. Nancy had once harbored feelings for David, writing love letters to him in her teenage spring. But all of it was callously thrown into the trash by David. Seeing David come to her, Nancy blushed with excitement. She looked up at David admiringly. Are you here just to see me? That little vixen Melody always liked to oppose you. She died, you must be happy. The next moment, David pressed the door with his hand. He grasped Nancy's shoulder with one hand, a glint of silver flashed in his hand, the tip of the knife aimed straight at her neck. In Nancy's increasingly bewildered gaze, David's long lashes fluttered as he softly murmured, "Why did you kill her? I will personally avenge her." That day, Nancy purposefully shooed away all the servants so she could enjoy a night of revelry alone. At the peak of her success, about to skyrocket, David came knocking. She was delighted, thinking it was David's approval of her. Little did she know, the Grim Reaper was at her door. Trembling, Nancy huddled in the corner, looking at David with fear in his eyes. No longer love, just fear. You're crazy. You're a maniac. David killed Nancy. Nancy's painful cries echoed in the villa all night, but she had no chance to wait for someone to come and save her. The street cameras were dark, and the security guards in the area were blocked. All for this quiet night, one stab after another, expressionless, he plunged the knife into the killer's body, avenging me. I floated in the air, feeling exhilarated yet extremely confused. Why would David do such a thing? He is now a shining star in the physics world, with a promising future. Why did he kill Nancy? It wasn't until I followed David back to his room, and when he opened the bedroom door, I was shocked. The dark room was covered with my photos, even the ceiling, from high school, college, to my first acting debut, photos from almost every phase were plastered all over. It was as if he was obsessively collecting everything related to me. But David? Him? The cold, aloof genius physicist David? It was unbelievable. When David killed Nancy, he was wearing a white shirt splattered with blood. Seemingly disgusted, he methodically took off his clothes one by one and threw them in the trash. I saw the well-built body hidden beneath the thin fabric. I couldn't help but blush, covering my eyes and peeking through my fingers. How can he have such a good body? I saw him open a cabinet. Inside was my urn. He actually dug out my ashes from the grave. He's supposed to be my archenemy. How could he turn out to be my deranged fan? David took out a clean white shirt from the closet and put it on. Then, holding my urn, he calmly got into the bathtub. He calmly filled the tub with water and cut his wrists with a knife. It seemed like suicide, a scene of extreme darkness, but amidst the spatters of blood, David's pale face showed a nearly entranced look. Melody, don't be afraid, wait for me. I choked. David, he actually loves me? Melody, let's be in the same group for tomorrow's lab class. The noise around brought me back to reality. I didn't know how, but as I blinked, I was already reborn, back in high school. In high school, I was the most popular student because of my outgoing personality, generosity, and a bit of good looks. The only exception was David. He was the cool guy that girls loved in his student days. Few words but good grades. But we never got along, although we were in the same class, we never treated each other kindly. We were known for being at odds in school. I remember we had a big fight not long ago. Right now, he was sitting in a corner of the classroom, coldly flipping through the pages of a book, seemingly detached from the surrounding noise. I glanced at David. He seemed irritated by the noise, slightly furrowing his brow. His pronounced jawline gave him a handsome, aloof, and unfriendly appearance. My desk mate, Ken, was surprised. He asked, Melody, are you going to fight with David again? There was almost a fight between you two yesterday, and you almost got caught by the headmaster. While the desk mate kept chattering, I felt a stir in my heart, picked up my bag, and walked toward David. Melody, are you serious? Be careful, he might punch you right away. I didn't know where the rumor came from saying that David was a fierce fighter outside school. Many boys idolized David. Ken was also David's superfan. But since David kept to himself and rarely interacted, Ken couldn't find a way to get close to him. Ken kept murmuring behind me, but I directly placed my bag on David's desk. Maybe because I blocked David's view of his book, he lifted his head and gave me a cold look. Chin up, I arrogantly said. Could you move over a bit, please? The whole class noticed the commotion here, involuntarily taking a cold breath. Ken leaned over to whisper, Melody, what are you doing? Come back, don't provoke him. Be careful not to upset him, you might get a beating. David seemed not to notice the tense atmosphere in the class. He maintained his cool guy face and coldly asked, What do you want? What did I want? I was really curious about David. The genius physicist from the previous life actually secretly loved me for years. Not only did he abandon his awards ceremony, returning home grim-faced to avenge me, and in the end, he resorted to despair, holding my urn and committing suicide. Was he my archenemy? When did he fall in love with me? Why? I pushed my bag in front of him, proudly saying, I want to be your desk mate. Upon hearing my words, the whole class gasped again almost simultaneously. Perhaps they thought I was crazy, daring to challenge the top student to this extent. Ken looked at this side with a face ready to face death, perhaps thinking about how to save me from David's hands when he started beating me. However, when David heard my words, the usual gloomy, cold, and murderous person strangely froze. He unconsciously curled his fingertips and lowered his long, feather-like eyelashes. After a while, David forced himself to speak calmly, Okay. You can sit there. He quickly added, as if afraid I would change my mind. David still maintained his expressionless cool guy appearance, but the faint pink color on his earlobes betrayed his calmness. I looked down at him, thinking to myself, so David had already liked me at this time. Behind me, Ken and the other classmates were almost dropping their jaws in shock. Why did he actually say yes? Ken stared at David with wide eyes. If I knew David was so easy to talk to, I would have moved next to him too. Before class, my homeroom teacher called me out to discuss about the competition. As I came back and just stepped into the back door, I saw a person standing in front of David's seat, wearing a school uniform with a pair of stiff black-rimmed glasses perched on the bridge of their nose. She lowered her eyes slightly and blushing, handed the pink envelope in her hand to David. It was Nancy. I stopped in my tracks, leaning against the door frame with interest, wanting to hear what Nancy had to say. With all the noise and hustle in the classroom, no one actually noticed May saw Nancy speak softly. David, I know Melody always seems to go against you, please don't take it to heart. Melody always acted like this, spoiled since childhood, always thinking that the whole world revolved around her. At home, she always went her own way because the family was wealthy and people around her kindly indulged her. Nancy's actions seemed like defending me to David, but in reality, every word indirectly implied my bad character and haughtiness, trying to pull David to her side. In my previous life, David and I were incompatible, and I never paid much attention to him. I never expected Nancy had once tried to sow discord between us. Although looking at the outcome, David ended up killing Nancy with his own hands. Clearly her schemes did not succeed. But the smile on my lips gradually froze, and I couldn't help but feel a bit itchy. Nancy. I haven't even started to deal with you in this life, and you come knocking on my door voluntarily? I stood up straight, ready to step forward, but I saw David take the envelope, and the next moment, without expression, he tore it up and crumpled it into the trash can. He looked down on Nancy, his eyes cold. A hint of disdain appeared on the young, pale face like a thin sheet of paper, with a mocking smile. He raised his eyelids slightly. What does it have to do with you how she treats me? Mind your own business. Clearly, David's impatience. But to Nancy's ears, it was interpreted in a different way. She thought David's words were a sign of his concern for her, and hastily spoke. Melody is very bad. She bullies you like this, you will lose out. Nancy reached out to grab David's sleeve. I grabbed David's wrist and pulled him to my side. I stared at Nancy with a half-smile and pronounced slowly, I'm bad? Nancy, I'm curious, how have I been bad to you? Tell me. Was it bad of me to kindly accept you and your mom into our family? Or was it bad of me to worry about your studies, arrange for you to transfer to this school, and hire someone to tutor you? In my past life, to prevent my father from worrying, I treated Nancy well with all my heart. I almost treated her like my own sister. I suggested she transfer schools to receive a good education, reminded classmates to take care of Nancy so she wouldn't feel out of place, and even took the time to select quality tutors for Nancy. Later, when Nancy graduated, I worried she would be bullied due to her timid nature and begged my father to buy an apartment near her school so she would have a place of her own. But never did I think that Nancy would dismiss each of these gestures and hold a grudge against me, plotting my death in a car accident to inherit the family fortune. For the past 10 years, I've exhausted myself, only to raise a wolf in sheep's clothing. When Nancy saw me, recalling what she had just said, her face turned pale in an instant. Nancy panicked and spoke. "Melody, when did you come? How much did you hear?" I sneered, "Everything." With that, I raised my hand and mercilessly slapped Nancy across the face. There was a crisp sound. A bright red palm print quickly appeared on Nancy's cheek. She stood there, as if she hadn't expected me to strike her directly. I tilted my eyes maliciously, smiling. "Sorry, I'm just bad. I'm used to doing whatever I want. If I want to hit you, I'll hit you. I'm not a saint. How could I possibly smile kindly at someone who tried to kill me in a car accident in the past life?" Nancy recovered from her shock and looked at David timidly, her eyes misted, seeking comfort. "David, see." I tilted my head, pulling David closer to me. "What? Do you have something to say to my desk mate?" Because of my actions, the distance between David and me was extremely close. Through the thin school uniform fabric, I could almost feel his warmth. The dark eyes of the young man trembled, his gaze involuntarily falling on me. A slight blush rose on his ears. Nancy was dumbfounded by this scene. It seemed that she never expected that the always aloof, indifferent, and unsociable David would one day become my desk mate, the nemesis. Nancy's lips trembled for a moment, and she stubbornly sought confirmation from David. "You and Melody?" Seeing Nancy's stubborn appearance, I felt annoyed. Just as I was about to speak harshly, I heard a low, hoarse voice above me. David was speaking. He pretended to be calm and said lightly, "Desk mates." Though it sounded cold, listening closely revealed a barely perceptible excitement in his voice. It seemed that he was glad to have such a special position, being Melody's desk mate. Nancy reddened for a moment, stamped her foot, glared at me in hatred, and said, "Melody, if you keep hitting me in school like this, I'll tell my uncle when I go back. Moreover, my father has always loved me. When I took the initiative to accept Nancy and her mother, they were able to move into our house smoothly. I could lift her up, but I could also make her fall hard." Nancy, feeling indignant, was about to go and complain. As she walked out from the classroom, she ran into Ken returning from playing basketball. Ken stared at Nancy in confusion and asked, "What's wrong with you?" Because I had specifically told Ken that Nancy was my stepsister, he treated her with extra care. Perhaps being too nice to Nancy made her a bit too arrogant. She thought Ken, being handsome and wealthy, always taking care of her, must have a special feeling for her. She believed that Ken would definitely take her side. Nancy grabbed Ken's sleeve and tearfully said, "Melody, I'm with Melody." Before she could finish her sentence, I raised an eyebrow and told Ken, "Nothing, I just slapped her." Ken, being quick-witted as always, understood everything in an instant. He raised his eyebrow at Nancy and said, "Melody slapped you?" Nancy bit her lip and nodded in grievance. She thought Ken would support her. However, the next second, Ken casually shrugged off Nancy's hand. He chuckled, "If our normally easygoing Melody actually slapped you, you must have done something really out of line." Then, Ken turned to me with a concerned look, holding my hand, asking if my hand hurt from slapping Nancy. He left Nancy standing there embarrassed. Amid Ken's playful banter, I noticed that Nancy's gaze towards me became more resentful. Ken intentionally called me out of the classroom. He casually asked about Nancy's situation. I shrugged, saying, "I suddenly couldn't stand her." Ken sighed softly, "I already told you, Nancy and her mother are ambitious. You should have listened to me. Now you know, right?" Then, Ken raised an eyebrow, teasingly leaned close to me, and whispered, "Melody, did you really start sitting next to David? Are you ignoring me? Do you have an ulterior motive for getting close to him?" Ken was still trying to gossip about me and David. I crossed my arms, chuckled, and said smugly, intentionally getting close to him. Don't you think it's David who likes me? You are being ridiculous. As soon as I said that, Ken burst into laughter as if he couldn't hold it in. He wiped a tear from his eye, laughing uncontrollably. Mocking me, he said, Melody, have you lost your mind? Are you dreaming? He would like you. Stop kidding me. You always can't stand David. Who knows what tricks you are up to now? I got so angry that I kicked him, saying, What are you talking about? While Ken and I argued, unbeknownst to us, David was standing at the corner, listening to our banter with a blank expression. David kept his head down, his dark, messy hair covering his deep, black eyes. His slender figure seemed fragile, trembling uncontrollably like a delicate weed swaying in the breeze. With pale lips and fingers gripping tightly as if ready to pierce his palm, his gaze was fixed on me, gloomy and paranoid. David murmured softly, Melody. I felt something off with David these days. He would coldly study his books every day, rarely interacting with me. However, whenever I glanced at him, I noticed the redness around his eyes. It seemed like he was waiting in despair for something to happen, on the verge of breaking down. Despite years of rivalry with David, we had never interacted as amicably before. Realizing this, during the evening self-study class, I nudged him with my pen, hesitantly asking, David, are you feeling unhappy these days? Leaning on my arm, I stared at David's defined jawline. Why are you not happy? I asked softly. David paused his study, clenching his pen tightly until his knuckles turned white. His long eyelashes stayed frozen for a moment before he coldly replied, No, I'm not unhappy. I nudged him again, whispering, What's really going on with you? Perhaps overwhelmed and confused, David sighed and moved away from me in silence, hoping to distance himself. I snorted, choosing to ignore him and sit up straight, preparing to let him be. After staring at the questions for a while, I couldn't resist anymore. I quickly wrote a few big words on a blank paper and pushed it towards David. What's wrong with you, seriously? This time, David finally lowered his head, glancing at the words I wrote. He carefully tucked the paper into a book page. Still, he remained silent. Feeling frustrated, I pushed the table hard to express my anger towards David. But the force was too much, causing a screeching sound as the table legs scraped against the floor. The whole class turned their eyes towards us. The chemistry teacher couldn't tolerate it and threw a piece of chalk at us. David. Melody. I've been watching you two for a while. If you have conflicts, sort them out outside. Don't play games here. David and I were both kicked out of the classroom. Standing in the corridor, I awkwardly touched my face as the cool night breeze blew. In my past life, would often get thrown out by teachers for arguing with Ken. But being thrown out with David, this cold and distant, arch-rival David, was a first. Ken was in the classroom laughing at my situation. I glared at David, blaming him, It's all because of you. David stood silently on the side. Even in punishment, he stood tall. He hung his head low, his raven-like lashes fluttered for a moment, as if making a crucial decision. His eyes reddened at the corners, tentatively tugging at my sleeve. His Adam's apple bobbed for a moment, and in a hoarse plea, he said, Melody. David seemed like he was about to shatter, his damp lashes pleading as he softly begged, Don't hurt me please. David's straight nose, cold and proud demeanor, made him look handsome and aloof. Seeing him suddenly show a fragile side made my heart tremble involuntarily. I turned my face away in a panic, trying to control the strange feeling in my heart, arguing back at him, When have I ever hurt you? Isn't it always you who insists on being against me? Suddenly, I remembered something and turned my head to stare at David, suspiciously asking, Do you think I have ulterior motives for being your desk mate and secretly want to mess with you? David pursed his lips and didn't say anything. That was his way of agreeing. During this period, David was indeed awkward. Clearly he was happy to be my desk mate, but at the same time, he couldn't help being on guard. I almost wanted to laugh out loud. I crossed my arms and stared at him, saying, Next time you have something on your mind, can you just say it directly? It's too troublesome to guess, thinking that I was unhappy. David perhaps felt that I disliked him. His fingers gradually relaxed and dropped to his side, his face turning pale. Like a piece of thin paper that would sway with the slightest breeze. He hung his head in loneliness and murmured softly, "I'm sorry." I grabbed his wrist and pulled him closer to me. Through gritted teeth, I said, "What I mean is, you can ask me anything, just say it directly, and I'll tell you. I'm not your desk mate to tease you, just because I want to know more about you." David suddenly looked up, his eyes sparkling like shards of jade igniting. Although still expressionless, it was as if he had suddenly come back to life. He stared at me in disbelief and murmured, "You want to know more about me? You don't dislike me?" Watching me and David coming and going together these days, the look on the faces of the students in the school was as if they had seen a ghost. Even Ken was shocked. He came over and asked in a hushed tone, "Melody, when did you become so close with David? Weren't you always at odds with each other?" I rolled my eyes and pushed Ken away, saying, "I think David is really gentle, so I'm willing to bury the hatchet and be friends with him." "What's it to you? Gentle?" Ken stared blankly at David, who was coldly focusing on the test paper. As we spoke, David gave Ken a cold look. His gaze was frosty, almost making Ken want to kneel down on the spot. With a start, Ken let go of my arm and took a cautious step back. He swallowed nervously and said, "I don't really understand your relationship, being archenemies and all." After Ken left, David tightened his grip on the pen, trying to appear indifferent as he coolly asked, You get along well with Ken, do you like him?" I frowned and replied, "Like? It's okay, we grew up together since we were kids." It seemed like something pricked David, his pupils constricted, and he looked flustered as he lowered his head, his voice cold. After a moment of silence, I lowered my head to look at David's expression. He stared at the test paper without a word, but his eyes were now completely red. I reached out to touch his face, saying, "David, are you jealous?" David turned away, trying to maintain his ice-cold cool guy expression, and said stiffly, "No." What right did he have to be jealous? He had no status, no position. Even if the other person knew his feelings but didn't like him, it was just being desk mates. I clicked my tongue and withdrew my hand, saying, "Okay then. Looks like someone doesn't really want to know that Ken and I have known each other since we were in diapers." David threw down the pen and reached out as if to cover my mouth. His eyes were red and his voice hoarse, "Stop. I don't want to hear. I don't want to hear it from you, how close you and Ken are." I stared at David's fragile appearance and suddenly lost my desire to tease him. David was so close to me. I could almost smell the fresh laundry detergent wafting from him. I tilted my head and said, "Ken and I are step-siblings. So, are you still jealous?" After a long silence, David blinked, pulling back his hand as if shocked. He looked down at the test paper, his ears red as if they could drip blood. His Adam's apple moved for a moment before he murmured softly, "No." During the chemistry experiment class, due to space constraints, another class was conducting the experiment with us at the same time. I was washing a test tube when Ken leaned in mysteriously next to me and whispered, "Melody, your stepsister is staring at us." I looked up and saw Nancy standing alone in front of her experiment table. Her gaze was resentful and filled with malice as she looked our way. Raising an eyebrow, I asked Ken, "Isn't an experiment group supposed to have 3 people together? Why is she alone?" Ken shrugged and sighed. "Initially everyone played with her because you specifically asked them to. But now that they all know she's bad-mouthing you behind your back, who would want to be around her? Isn't she asking for trouble?" Previously, when Nancy transferred in, I had sent her classmates many gifts and asked them to take good care of her. Now that I and Nancy had fallen out, the whole school knew I didn't like her, so naturally no one would willingly hang out with her. I chuckled at the result, not surprised at all. I could uplift her to heaven and just as easily bring her down to hell. Moreover, that day Nancy angrily threatened to go back and report me to my father, who had been away on a business trip and was not at home during that time. Nancy had nowhere to complain, so she could only hold her anger. She became even more resentful towards me. I smirked at her and silently said, "Serves you right." Perhaps because I had been away from school for too long, I had completely forgotten the process of conducting experiments. When I attempted to pour the sodium hydroxide solution directly into the test tube, David stopped me, saying, "Wrong, use a measuring cup first." David, tall and composed, looked at me quietly with a bit of pressure in his gaze as he observed me before the small experiment table. I awkwardly put down the test tube and was about to pick up the measuring cup when I saw Nancy walking towards us. Nancy completely ignored me and Ken, and smiled flirtatiously at David. She softly asked, "David, I ran out of dilute sulfuric acid on my end. Could I borrow some from you guys?" I lowered my head to measure 1 milliliter of sodium hydroxide solution and did not look up. David didn't like Nancy. He frowned and did not respond to her. He turned to me and instructed on the next step of the experiment, pouring it into the 4th test tube. Nancy was blatantly ignored by David. The smile on her lips froze. After a moment of silence, she looked at Ken and managed to squeeze out a smile. "Ken, I ran out of dilute sulfuric acid. Could I borrow some from you guys?" Ken raised an eyebrow, lazily smiled, and said, "Why ask us? Can't you ask the teacher for it? This is just a polite way of refusing." Nancy still insisted, "Just a small amount, I'll return it to you as soon as I'm done." As Nancy reached out to grab the reagent bottle on the experiment table, just as she was about to touch it, she seemed to lose her balance and intended to splash it on my face. The liquid she was about to pour was dilute sulfuric acid. Although not as corrosive as concentrated sulfuric acid, it can still be irritating if splashed on the skin. Her demeanor suggested that she was determined to disfigure me. It was a devious and despicable act. Did Nancy not consider the consequences of her actions? Without hesitation, I grabbed Nancy's wrist and forcefully pressed it into the sink. The dilute sulfuric acid in the bottle spilled all over Nancy's hand, causing her to scream in pain. I casually turned on the faucet and said softly, "Be careful, don't accidentally splash it on someone else." When such an incident occurred in class, the teacher hurried over and took Nancy to the infirmary for treatment. Nancy, in intense pain, was sweating profusely and looked miserable. I looked down at her and smirked, saying, "You won't be arrogant for much longer. You and your mom won't even be able to stay at home for much longer." Suddenly, the weather changed, and a heavy rain started pouring. I couldn't be bothered to go to school in the rain. I stayed in a corner of my room, quietly listening to the rain outside. Meanwhile, Nancy was downstairs crying and complaining to her mother, "That little bee ****** Melody. She splashed sulfuric acid on me. She's so vicious." As I tapped my fingers on the coffee table, I suddenly felt foolish. Nancy had concealed her resentment towards me so poorly in this life. Why hadn't I noticed anything until now? It wasn't until she killed me and my soul floated in the air that I realized how much Nancy had resented me for a long time. Lost in my thoughts, I suddenly heard a text notification on my phone. It was a message from David, "Come downstairs, I'll bring you the test papers." I looked up and saw a tall young man holding a black umbrella standing silently in the pouring rain outside. From my angle, I could only see half of his handsome profile under the umbrella. I thought to myself, in my previous life, I must have been blind. Why was David's affection for me so apparent now, after I had already died? I opened the door and went downstairs. Nancy was still downstairs ranting to her mother about me. When she saw me, she was shocked and exclaimed in disbelief, "Melody, why are you upstairs? Aren't you going to school?" Shouldn't she have checked if the person she was badmouthing was even at home before speaking ill of them behind their back? I ignored them, walked past them, opened the door, and went out. David had been waiting outside, and his eyes lit up when he saw me. David was concerned that I might get wet from the drizzle, so he subconsciously tilted the umbrella towards me and handed me a stack of test papers. "Melody, here are the test papers." Despite holding an umbrella, David's shoulders were already soaked from the downpour. After handing me the papers, David turned to leave. I grabbed his sleeve. David paused, turned around, and fixed his dark eyes on me, looking puzzled. "What's wrong?" I raised an eyebrow lazily and asked, "David, did you really come all this way in the rain just to bring me the test papers?" As soon as those words left my mouth, the boy with the frosty demeanor seemed to freeze, looking shyly away, his Adam's apple moving as he hesitated to speak. I stared at him and urged, "Speak." Under my coercion, David had changed from the cool guy he used to be. Although still a man of few words, he had learned to be honest with me. His Adam's apple rolled, and with his eyes downcast, he softly said, "I wanted to see you." Surprised by his unexpected response, I smiled, reached out to touch his cheek, and said, "Good boy." Startled by my intimate touch, David's ears turned completely red. His wet eyes blinked non-stop, as if he was afraid this was all a fleeting dream. I took his hand and led him inside, saying, "The rain is too heavy now. Don't rush to go back. Stay for a while." As we entered the room, Nancy and her mother stood awkwardly, caught in the act of talking behind my back. Seeing me lead David inside, Nancy's eyes widened in disbelief, and her face turned pale as she stammered, "David? What are you doing here?" David glanced at Nancy as if she were irrelevant, displaying a sense of indifference. It seemed like this was David's first time entering a girl's room. The aloof and indifferent boy now stood awkwardly, with a slight blush on his cheeks. I pulled him over, made him sit on the sofa, and teased him, "Why are you so easily embarrassed?" If Ken had witnessed this scene, he would definitely argue. With a frosty expression, one could hardly tell he was shy. "Are you delusional, Melody?" Suddenly realizing I had been foolish, I pushed past them, walked out the door. David had been waiting outside and his eyes lit up as he saw me. David was worried about the gentle rain might hit me, unconsciously tilting the umbrella towards me. Handing me a stack of papers, he said, "Melody, your test papers." With the pouring rain, even with an umbrella, David's shoulders had already gotten wet. After handing me the test papers, David turned to leave. I grabbed his sleeve. As David paused, turned back and his dark eyes settled firmly on me, looking puzzled, "What's the matter?" With a lazy raised eyebrow, I asked, "David, did you really come all this way in the rain just to bring me the test papers?" Once out, the boy with a frosty demeanor seemed to freeze, looking shyly away with his Adam's apple moving as if hesitating to speak. I stared at him and urged, "Say it." Over this period, David, under my bullying and temptations, was no longer the same cool guy as before. Despite being silent and reserved, he had learned to be honest with me. With a gulp, his eyes downcast, he softly said, "I wanted to see you." Surprised by his unexpected reply, I smiled, reached out to touch his cheek, and said, "Good boy." Startled by my touch, David's ears were already red as he blinked his wet eyes unblinkingly, as if worried it was all just a dream. Taking his hand, I led him inside, saying, "The rain is too heavy now. Don't rush to go back. Stay for a while." Upon entering the room, Nancy and her mother were caught in the act of talking ill behind my back and stood awkwardly in place. Seeing me bring David inside, Nancy's eyes widened in disbelief, her face turning pale as she stammered, "David? Why are you here?" David glanced over at Nancy, seeming to view her as insignificant, showing a sense of indifference. Seemingly stepping into a girl's room for the first time, the aloof and indifferent boy now stood awkwardly with a slight blush on his cheeks. I pulled him over, made him sit on the sofa, teasing him, "Why are you so easily embarrassed?" If Ken had witnessed this scene, he would definitely argue, with a frosty face, "Where could you tell there was shyness? Is your delusional syndrome acting up, Melody?" But at that moment, David stared stiffly at the ground and muttered softly in response. Even though David brought the test paper, I had no intention of studying. Casually leaning back against David on the sofa, I suddenly had an idea. I leaned closer to David and asked, "Do you only study and play games every day?" David honestly shook his head. Just as I suspected. I pulled David to download a game and pass the time together. David was obedient. However, when logging into the game and creating the character name for the first time, he furrowed his brow and then without hesitation, entered RC. I froze. Because I remembered from my past life, in the fan group, there was a big fan of mine who had supported me silently since my debut, and his name was RC. It turned out that everything had already left clues. David, seeing me silent for a while, blinked in confusion and asked, "What's wrong?" Half kneeling on the sofa, I leaned closer to David. I raised a finger to my lips, looked into his dark eyes, and softly asked, "David, do you want a kiss?" The young man suddenly widened his eyes in surprise. His raven-like long lashes flickered, Adam's apple bobbing, honestly saying, "I do." In an instant, the young man tilted his head up, his eyelashes trembling as he moved closer to me. Just before our lips were about to meet, he stubbornly spoke again, "I do." As David kissed me, he hesitated and grasped for certainty. Perhaps the emotions that couldn't be expressed in words all fell into this one kiss, appearing chaotic yet intense. David's breath was rapid, cravingly licking my lips. The rain outside pattered gently, warm and sunny inside like a spring day. My father Sam's half-month business trip ended, and he returned home quickly. Nancy rushed to him as soon as she saw him, took his hand, and coquettishly said, "Daddy. You're finally back." I stood with my arms crossed, watching coldly. After Nancy exchanged a few words with Sam, she suddenly looked up with a grievance. "Dad, Melody doesn't like me, I know, but she's gone too far. She even publicly slapped me in front of the whole class. And even went as far as causing my hand to be splashed with acid." Nancy raised her hand, showing Sam the arm corroded into a terrifying shape. She didn't mention the beginning and the end, just wanting to splash dirt on me. Didn't she know that no matter how distant my relationship with my father was, I was his biological daughter? Sam glanced casually, gently saying, "You two sisters are always fooling around, how careless. I'll ask Melody to be more careful in the future." He was quick to take my side and casually tried to brush this matter aside. Nancy widened her eyes, incredulously calling out, "Dad?" Sam calmly moved her hand away, still wearing a gentle expression. I stepped forward and dropped a report on the table. The report detailed every conflict between Nancy and me at school, as well as instances where Wendy schemed and instigated Nancy to cause trouble for me in secret. In front of Nancy and Wendy, I calmly said, "Father, I think Wendy is not suitable to be your wife. It's time to change." With these words, both Nancy and Wendy's faces changed involuntarily. Wendy forced a smile. "Melody, what are you talking about? It's just girls fooling around, how did it come to this?" Sam bent down, picking up the documents I had tossed on the table. He flipped through them expressionlessly. Wendy moved forward to tug at his sleeve. "Just children's jokes, don't mind." In the next moment, Sam gently brushed away her hand, his gaze approvingly turning to me. "Melody, well done, looks like you have grown a lot." Then he turned and said with a calm expression, but with no room for negotiation, mentioning the prenuptial agreement had already been discussed. What he needed was to find a caring mother for his children, not someone secretly causing trouble for my daughter. Earlier, he chose you because Melody seemed to like Nancy, her older sister. But now you've done this to Melody. Inappropriate. In an instant, the faces of Wendy and Nancy, the mother and daughter, turned ashen. Sam's divorce was swift. Well, for a businessman who was profit-driven, reputation and benefits were of utmost importance. Wendy never received his affection. The gentleness he had shown before was merely to maintain such a family, carefully calculated. Nancy and Wendy were kicked out of the mansion looking dejected. Before leaving, Nancy looked at me with resentful eyes, as if she wanted to devour me whole. I stood above, smiling and raising my hand in a shooting gesture. Did she think my revenge was just that light? This was a deep-seated enmity, of course, it had to be repaid with the same for some reason. During this time, David's gaze on me became even deeper. He always waited in deserted places, then would suddenly grab my waist. The deep darkness in his eyes was cryptic. He seemed uncontrollably drawn to touch me. David held my hand. He kissed me, nibbling on my lips. In the darkness, it seemed like a thin layer of mist engulfed our sight. He whispered softly, repeatedly confirming to me, "Melody. Mine. We'll never separate, not even in death." I tilted my head back, a clear arc forming on my neck. The young man's hot lips landed delicately on my skin. David's voice was hoarse. "Melody, so beautiful, so lovely. Nancy somehow arranged for me to be kidnapped." When I woke up again, it was in a rundown factory. Nancy stood across from me, looking crazy. Melody, you've been so lucky in your lifetime. Sam protects you without hesitation, even David. She paused, her expression becoming more fierce. Even David protects you. You bitch. Who do you think you are? Nancy grabbed my collar, hysterically shouting. I raised my head, slightly moving my shoulders. It was so bizarre to be tied up by Nancy at this place, almost suffocating me. Seeing Nancy acting so crazed, I smiled. Who do I think I am? I think I'm worth it. I lifted my chin, looking disdainfully at Nancy. I once offered you good things, but you didn't want them yourself. Nancy's hair was a mess. She grabbed my wrist tightly, screaming, why does everyone like you? You deserve to die. Even though I was tied up and unable to move, I remained calm and fearless in the face of Nancy's madness. I chuckled, every person who likes me is because I gave my true heart. What about you? Who have you given your heart to? I had given my heart to Nancy. I had sincerely hoped for her well-being. But, she extinguished my intentions. Someone who wasted one of my hearts, I wouldn't care anymore. Stung by my words, Nancy angrily stared at me, reaching out to strangle my neck. Die. You bitch, die. I blinked and said softly, all right, in my past life, David avenged me, and this life, I can kill you myself. I waited for Nancy to make a move, waited for a long time. When I thought Nancy wouldn't strike again, she eventually came to abduct me. Nancy coldly sneered, bitch, facing death, you're still talking tough. No one will come to save you. I smiled and said, I've never hoped for someone to save me, because from the beginning, I only wanted to settle our hatred between us. Sister. Hearing my seldomly used term of endearment, Nancy paused. I softly spoke. The next second, a bullet shot into Nancy's temple at a speed of 1,420 meters per second, exploding a spray of blood on her forehead. She fell straight down, staring with puzzled eyes, not understanding how everything changed so suddenly before her death. There was no sudden change in fate, it was all meticulously planned by me. After my people cleaned up the scene, I finally called David. I said, David, come find me. I didn't tell him my exact location. But half an hour later, the gloomy young man appeared on time at the rundown warehouse. In the empty and silent warehouse, I sat on a high stool in the center, tilting my head slightly to look at the cold-faced handsome guy before me. I looked at him and said firmly, you placed a tracker on me. When did you do it? David walked silently to me and knelt down, looking up at me. His face was as pale as paper, his ink-like long eyelashes trembling for a moment before he whispered softly, I'm sorry, Melody, don't hate me. David reached out and held my hand, planting a kiss on it devoutly. He choked back a sob, like a scared young animal afraid of being abandoned. Please don't hate me. David's eyes were red at the corners, watery. I raised my hand to touch his neck. I asked, you answer. He said, okay. When did you start liking me? On the third day of school, when you stood on the balcony, the sunlight shining on you, you were glowing sooner than I thought. How long have you had a crush on me? David hesitated, seeming reluctant, and said softly, looking down, 13 years. Why didn't you confess? David lifted his gaze to me, took a deep breath, and said, you hated me. If you really hated him, why would you have been at odds with him for so long, confronting each other like that? My love and hatred were always clear. David was one of my few exceptions. I looked down and commented, fool. Not sure if I'm talking about David or myself. One last question. Did it hurt when you committed suicide in the past life? David reached out, grabbing my hand and pressing it against his cheek, showing that obsessed and intoxicated expression again. He said, I was happy. Just like in the last life, not long after, David was admitted directly to the world's top university's physics department. During that time, David seemed very relaxed. He no longer focused on studying, instead spending his days holding me, kissing me, and teaching me how to solve problems. He was a terrifying genius. High school knowledge was like memories of 10 years ago for him, yet he could effortlessly recall it all. David appeared refined on the surface, but in secret, he would repeatedly lick me. He even envied his past self. Why? How come that guy could get Melody's care? Did Melody kiss him? He was only 18, quite innocent. I'm different, I'm mature, I love Melody more than he does. David seemed annoyed at not receiving the care that was exclusive to Melody. I laughed. You are the same person, whether it's teenage David or young David. I like you a lot. I like your cold demeanor as a top student, as well as your confident appearance on the award stage. In the past life, we were at the peak, about to reunite, but we died at the most brilliant moment of our lives. What a pity. I nudged David with my toe. Why do you like physics? He paused, lifted his eyes like black pearls, and stared straight at me because every atom in your body comes from exploding stars. The atoms in your left hand may have come from different stars than those in your right hand. And maybe my heart and Melody's heart come from the same star. That's the most poetic knowledge in physics that I know. Everything in you is stardust. Maybe billions of years ago, I was a satellite orbiting around you, and a star explosion shattered us, scattering our atoms to meet in the galaxy light years away. Everything in you is celestial, and I am still revolving around you. Stars die, only in this life can I meet you.